Today's topic is China's global diplomacy, COVID-19 and beyond. And it will be led by Professor Kerry Brown, who has kindly availed himself for this discussion. And our chair for this evening will be Dr. David Meyer. Now, ladies and gentlemen, these events are, of course, enriched by your participation. And so we encourage you to make use of the button to raise your hand, or indeed the message board to post your messages throughout the course of the seminar, which will then be engaged with in the question and answer session. And your questions and your comments are, of course, always very welcome. Now, our chair for this evening is Dr. David Meyer, who is, of course, our executive director at the Center for African Studies and at the Confucius Institute. Before this, he was, of course, in the South African Parliament, where he was the section manager for research. And before that, he was with the Developmental Bank of Southern Africa, where he was a senior analyst. Now, Dr. Meyer is also, of course, an academic and has taught at various universities, University of Johannesburg, Wits University, and of course, has contributed in national and international news media. Dr. Meyer, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Baso, for being so kind. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you, and I think many people join us along the way. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome Professor Kerry Brown, a very close friend for the Center for Africa-China Studies. Professor Brown is a well-known scholar. He has many books that I cannot go through now, but the bio that we have supplied you, details all his wonderful books that we all have gone through. And Professor Brown is also currently is the Professor of Chinese Studies and Director for the Lao China Institute at King's College in London, and Associate Fellow of Asia Pacific Program at Chatham House in London as well. From 2012 to 2015, he was Professor of Chinese Politics and Director of the China Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. Prior to this, from 1998 to 2005, he served as a diplomat in the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And then from 2006 to 2012, Senior Fellow and then Head of Asia Program at Chatham House. He was Director of the Europe-China Research and Advice Network under the auspices of European Union, and he's the author of 20 books, as I've mentioned earlier, and the most recent one, which is China Dreams, the Culture of Communist Party and the Secret Sources of Power, as well as the Trouble with Taiwan, History, and the United States Rising China. Without wasting time, this is a special lecture. Professor Brown was supposed to have come to Johannesburg, and everything was organized, tickets and everything. But then little did we know that Corona was right on the corner. So due to prevailing global condition pertaining to Corona, he's unable to be here with us. But nonetheless, the digital world that we've entered still allow us to give Professor Brown a chance to give this lecture today. With that, I'd like to give you the platform, Professor Brown. I hand over to you now.
Thank you very much. And I'm very grateful for you inviting me here today to talk. I'm sorry I can't be there physically, but it's great to be able to still be able to do something. Shall I talk for about 20 minutes? Is that right? 20, 25 minutes?
Yeah, that's
okay. Great. Well, I'm going to obviously talk about China's diplomacy and its position now. And COVID-19, coronavirus, has obviously made its position much sharper, more difficult. It's created lots of challenges for China. It's also, I think, deepened some of the problems in America and Europe and elsewhere about China's position in the world because of its different political model, its difference in values. And it's, I think, suddenly alerted a lot of people who never really thought about China before very much to the fact that there is this very significant economy and very significant power that is obviously very, very different to anyone else. I mean, its political model is really unique. Everything is, socialism with Chinese characteristics, globalism with Chinese characteristics. It's very, very kind of unique model. And on top of this, it's a fifth of global GDP. It's a fifth of global population. So this is not a sort of simple issue. And I think COVID-19 has brought all of this complexity to the surface. We see in all sorts of areas, particularly in America and Europe and in the UK, China figuring in ways which are new, also intense and disruptive. There's opportunities, but also there are clearly huge risks that people are thinking about. Just very quickly, I think in the European context, I mean, there's just been the summit between Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang and the High Representative and head of the Commission in the EU, the main leaders here. And it's striking that I think, in the past, until quite recently, in the era of engagement, so really from 1978 when China started its economic reforms till today, the kind of predominant philosophy, I suppose, was to work with China to economically see it become more capitalist and assume that in this way it would also then undergo political reform. And under Xi Jinping since 2012, I think we've seen a kind of real rebuttal of this. It's clear that as of today, and it doesn't look likely that it's going to happen, anytime soon, China is not going to politically change to become like a multi-party kind of democratic model. And so we're sort of in the post-engagement in order to see China politically change era. And I think that means there's lots of disappointment that's kind of coming to the surface. And I think Chinese politicians do question this and say, well, whoever said that we were just engaging with you, so that you could change our political views, our political, mindset. So there's a sort of sense of both sides kind of having a very big miscommunication. And so what I'm trying to really do today is sort of sit in the middle. It's not easy to sit in the middle in many ways, because both China and the United States in particular want loyalty from people. But what I'm really trying to do is try and establish this kind of territory, the little bit of territory that's still left between, to say, okay, what kind of world will work when you've got an America with a very strong view that its way is right, and making its allies also kind of line up behind it on things like Huawei and issues like this, the telecoms company. And a China which is equally strongly saying, we deserve our place and we shouldn't kind of be crammed into, some sort of very small space. We deserve, as a big major power that's undergoing its great renaissance, restoring itself to global primacy, the way that it was 150, 200 years ago before the modern era. We don't want to be treated like a little kind of, country. We want to be a great player on our own terms. So this is obviously clear. Even in just explaining this, you can see that there is a big, big disconnect. And the question is, how bad can it get? Is it manageable? And what do we do in order to manage this disconnect? I guess there's three things about coronavirus that we can think about. The first is obviously the public health challenge. And although there has been recurrences of coronavirus in Beijing, particularly in the last few days, the city is now restricting movements in and out of it. There's been a recurrence of the people getting the virus. So there's a fear that this might kind of accelerate and return China to the position it was in at the beginning of the year. This kind of, despite that, it's likely that China, because of the enormous amount of effort it's put into this, has controlled the main emergency era of this particular virus. And it's now clear that in Europe and in the United States and other places, the public health challenge is almost not over, but the most difficult phase is over. Although there are other parts of the world, Latin America, for instance, where it is obviously still very, very serious. The question about this particular public health issue was who did best. So at the beginning of the year, particularly in Europe, many, when the issue didn't really figure in their lives, and they kind of didn't think that it was a big, it wasn't going to come to them, it was going to be like SARS in 2003, it was going to stay as a predominantly Asian issue. They were very, very critical of the way China handled it. They felt that China, kind of local officials in Wuhan, particularly where the first cases became noticeable, they felt that the officials had buried information and hadn't really told leaders in Beijing, and that China's leaders had not then told the rest of the world. The Chinese government says this isn't so. As soon as it knew there was a problem, it did tell the world. So there's this kind of argument about who has to bear blame. But what we do see is that as the coronavirus spread, it exposed all kinds of governments with all sorts of different models to the same issue of a poor response. And in many ways, the Chinese government, in comparison, did not do badly. But there have been other governments, obviously, Taiwan government, Japan, South Korea, that have also done comparatively well. But European governments, the UK in particular, Italy, Spain, France, have all had a really, really tough time. So all you can say about that is it does not particularly help if you're a democracy to deal with these issues. You don't do any better. So there's no sort of points to really be won there. You can say that certain governments in particular places, some of them democracies, have done really well. You can say that other governments in other places, some of them not democracies, have done well. There's no common pattern. Everyone has found this challenging. And all we can conclude from that was the public health pandemic, that was always going to be challenging no matter what kind of government you had. So I guess the second thing about COVID-19 that we've noticed is it has alerted a lot of new kind of political figures, politicians, particularly in Europe and America, to China, and to this idea that somehow China has to be blamed. And then it has created a response from China, the wolf diplomacy that we've heard lots about recently, which is also pushed back. So it has definitely led to a deterioration of diplomatic discourse. And with the fight between the president of America and Zhao Lijian, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson in Beijing, about what Mr. Trump called the Wuhan virus or the China virus, these very inflammatory words, has really created a big, big sort of a burden of sort of misunderstanding, but also bad feeling. Someone, I think The Economist, called this not a Cold War, but a scold war, both sides scolding each other. And I suppose it's been confusing because it's difficult to work out in what way this is just language, it's rhetoric, it's the way that people speak when they're, kind of winding people up, and in what way it's real and we should worry about it. This isn't just words. America has made a number of threats. China has also kind of become quite assertive on the Indian border. There's kind of been lots of claims that China is getting involved in the politics of places like Australia. There are moves to stop Huawei, the telecoms company, becoming involved in particularly Europe and America. There's all sorts of issues about the way that China is perceived and the claims made about the sort of diplomacy it practices. And some of these are valid, and some of them are because really it's the first time that I think people have noticed that China is such an important actor, and they have a whole bunch of assumptions about what China is and how it behaves. And it's mostly about, I guess, their perceptions rather than what actually China is doing. They see a threat, but they don't really kind of define what that threat is. They just think China is a threat, and that's as far as you get. And I guess there's all sorts of things that we can worry and be concerned about, the way that China behaves. But we must be very specific about that. And I think one of the things that's noticeable is that it's very abstract, the way that people talk about the operations of the United Front, organization in China, and the way that China is using its propaganda or diplomacy abroad, it's almost sort of assuming that China is doing certain things before it's even looked at the evidence. And so it's difficult in this situation to really work out what's happening, because I think many people, their claims they reach the conclusion before they've done the kind of thinking to get to that conclusion. I guess the third thing about COVID-19 is that we are now into, I think, the second phase, and that is that the principal area of interest moves to the economic outcomes. The fallout of COVID-19 because of lockdowns across the world is already proving to be brutal. The UK economy has shrunk by a quarter, absolutely extraordinary impact. America's got 13 million unemployed. That's gone slightly down, but it's still 10 million more than even at the beginning of the year. China itself has seen the first dramatic fall in its GDP really within the last 40 years, maybe within the last 70, something like 6.5%. So we are now in the kind of battleground of who is able to restore their economy to growth, but also to preserve jobs. And oddly, that gives a kind of common framework. Whatever the political circumstances and arguments, in fact, the tasks for governments across the world now are to restore growth somehow and to ensure that employment remains stable. And those are issues for America, for China, for Australia, for New Zealand, and for the UK. So that kind of common area is sort of an opportunity in a strange way. Although it's been a very divisive period, this has created a kind of level of commonality where it is likely that pragmatism is going to get people through. And the question, I suppose, is who does the best there? This is kind of like we're not having the Olympics this year. I mean, that's been delayed. It might be postponed for good. But, we're having another kind of Olympics, which is the economic Olympics. Will China walk away with a gold medal? Will it be able to restore its economy to growth quicker than others? So not only will it then have proved it can deal with pandemics relatively efficiently, but it will also have proved that it can deal with economic issues more efficiently than traditional capitalist models. So in the National People's Congress in May, delayed from earlier in the year, there were lots of measures to try and create urban jobs, to try and create growth and give sort of stimulus, not a fiscal stimulus as such yet, but certainly lots of support to provinces. And kind of really an intent for China to make sure that it wins this economic Olympics. But we also, of course, have lots of measures now being introduced in Europe. We have lots of measures elsewhere in the world. America introducing quite extraordinary amounts of kind of state bailouts, really trying to stimulate growth and get the economies into a sort of healthier place. And so if that works, we kind of restore a sort of status quo. If the, America, Europe sort of capitalist mode works and they're able to kind of, restore growth and save jobs and create jobs, and China does too, well, that's a stalemate. I mean, we cannot get a draw. It proves that both systems are viable. But if China comes out more quickly than others, then this is definitely going to be the world's greatest advert for socialism with Chinese characteristics, at least for the Chinese government under Xi Jinping. This is a massive propaganda coup. If, however, it's that the capitalist models will be more resilient and be able to get out better than China, well, then we will have proved that capitalism still has life in it and under democratic values. So this is really quite a sort of extraordinary battle. It's not explicit. No one talks in this way. I mean, not politicians anyway, but I think it's very clearly there. The question is, who is going to be able to get out of the situation economically that we're all in? I suspect that it's going to be, it's likely that China will, because it's got so many levers, because of its centralized economic model, it will do everything it can to ensure that it gets some kind of results and growth and jobs. And it's questionable whether Europe in particular is able to do that. America may well still have an enormous fight with the pandemic before it can start to do the job of recreating its economic prowess. And of course, there's an election, which is going to be a big distraction in November this year. So, I think China, if you're sort of into betting, which of course I'm not, but if you are into betting, you would say, I think China is not looking bad. I think, of course, things could go badly wrong. But I think, it's got a track record of being able to deal with these sorts of crises. SARS 20 years ago, when it came back quite resiliently afterwards. This is obviously a much, much bigger problem, but it has got a track record. And in many ways, it's geared to dealing with crises. It's sort of like the ultimate crisis manager. The Communist Party of China does these things well. So I think that China's position is not bad. Although things could go wrong at the moment, I think it's probably in a pretty good, a better place. Not a great place, but a better place than the others crowded around it. So I guess that is going to have some significant political outcomes. So we've gone from the public health issue to the economic issue, but as always with China, we end up with the politics. And that's what I'll conclude with, really, the concluding sort of remarks I'll make. We are looking, therefore, at a sort of situation where there's every likelihood, more quickly than anyone expected, that China will be the world's biggest economy. It's now about 70% of the American economy. And if its growth is restored and America's growth declines, then, the kind of figures are going to change quite dramatically. At the moment, before COVID-19, the assumption was that sometime in the next decade, in the next 10 years, America, will be overtaken by China economically. And that's going to be an enormous symbolic moment and a psychological moment. And it's not a moment that I think America is at all looking forward to and feels comfortable about. It means it will not be number one, at least in this area. It will be number one in terms of military prowess and all sorts of other areas. But this is sort of, a huge, huge kind of prize. This is the ultimate prize. To be number one economically is something that I think China really does dream about. China dreams about many things, but I think this is one of the big parts of it. The Communist Party, this is an enormous kind of support for their legitimacy, that they have won in this race to become, the kind of world's biggest economy. What that means, therefore, is a kind of very different geopolitical world. A world in which China's space is so dominant in ways unlike any before in the modern era. And it's not going to be an easy transition, not just because America likes to be number one, but because China is politically and in terms of its values so very different to America. It is not a universalist. It does not accept almost all of the political values of the United States. And it certainly doesn't accept its vision of, kind of the proselytizing necessity to distribute and promote and praise its values. It's maybe a self-interested actor. My interpretation of China is not a proselytizer, it's a self-interested actor. So it will mean that the world's most important economy will also be a fairly self-interested one. It's not really speaking the same language of multilateralism as others, and it certainly has not behaved in the same way as others in the South and East China Sea and things like that. It's got a different mode of behavior. And so really this is sort of a huge, huge question, what to do about this. I think there are two choices. One is, of course, to contest this, to create a global alliance in which China is contained and pushed back into its space, and kind of somehow this moment is delayed and delayed and delayed, and kind of China is, we're just sort of on a holding pattern where everything is controlled until the day when things become soluble, but they're not soluble now. The problem with that, of course, is that China will absolutely contest that, and also This is not like the Cold War with the USSR, where the economies and so many things were neatly separated. China is deeply integrated into global finance and global supply chains, as the COVID-19 has shown. It's deeply involved in climate change issues. It's deeply involved in public health issues now. It's deeply involved in research. So there are no easy boundaries. So a Cold War number 2, I don't think is at all likely. This is way more complicated. So, kind of trying to kind of push China into a space that everyone else feels, it needs to have, will end up, I think, being divisive and very, very unstable. So it seems to me in conclusion that, there is another alternative, and that is a sort of 2-track world. We are, in a sense, moving from a bungalow, a 1-story house to a 2-story house. And most accidents happen on the stairs. So, we've had the kind of unilateral moment, the kind of unipolar moment since the fall of the Soviet Union. And now that's ending, and we're kind of moving into, this sort of structure where America has its space, China has its space. There are kind of ways of them communicating with each other. There's sort of all sorts of ways of them occupying the same kind of, sort of structures sometimes and sharing certain things. But there's also lots and lots of areas where they will just have to, be separated from each other. That is going to be a hard world to manage. It's going to be a golden age of diplomacy, I think. There'll be many diplomats who want to who will need to police this. It will probably not be sustainable forever, but it's going to at least, I think, give the world a relatively long period of time to try and work out how you combine 2 such different visions of what the global order should be. 2 visions of what order is, period. I mean, they have very, very different, attitudes about what it is to be human, what it is to be, kind of political. And these are massive, massive differences. And at the very least, a 2-track way gives people space to learn enough about each other to be able to undertake that. So that's really, I think, kind of the things I've been learning or thinking about from COVID. It would be good to hear your views and get your kind of feedback. I don't think we are going to have a particularly relaxing time in the next few years, but I think the issue really is how we are able to stabilize things and avoid a complete clash. And there are things, of course, Taiwan and other things that could provoke that clash, and that would be a complete disaster for everyone, including China. And it's also important, finally, to remember that the global pandemic has ironically shown that there are certain issues which definitely don't respect boundaries. Global health is one of them, but also climate change and the environment. So there are many areas in which, in some ways, we are working more intensely with each other. But there are other areas where our disagreements have become, I think, the disagreements have become much more visible and tangible and much clearer. So those are really my sort of overall remarks, and it would be great to hear your feedback and any questions, comments, or corrections that you have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Ladies and gentlemen, I think you all have had Prof statement and views on what's going on right now in the global arena. There's quite a lot of people that can please show by a sign that you have a question or you want to make a statement on what's going on this particular subject matter. Is there anyone?
There is. Let me just make him an admin. You can go ahead, please, Dr. Matambo.
Good afternoon, Baso, Dr. Meyer, and Professor Kerry Brown. Thank you very much, Professor, for your very insightful presentation there. I have a question on the very last point that you made, Prof, on the possibility of a two-track international system. If China, or may I say when China becomes a dominant economy, what implications is that likely to have for Africa's engagement with China and the United States, because I'm speaking this with the background in mind of the Cold War, when aid and relations between China, between Africa and the superpowers was not so much tailored towards Africa's development, but towards winning Africa's support in global diplomacy. So would you see the possibility of that happening and hence hampering Africa's development? Because then Africa will only be engaged on as a pawn, so to say, in the power between the two superpowers.
Thank you.
Any other?
I've noted another question, but the person is unable to speak. The question says that Professor Kerry highlighted the Olympics analogy, which implies in the recovery process that there's going to be economic Olympics, which implies some level of competition. And so the person says that this implies a sort of beggar thy neighbor world, economically speaking, of protectionism, mercantilism, which was seen during the Great Depression. And indeed, this week we've seen in the meeting between Chinese and EU leaders, the EU side pressing on things, looking as if it's looking for reasons to sideline China, talking about investigation over the arrival of the coronavirus starting in Wuhan, calling for an independent review of that, questioning Chinese SOEs, raising issues over Hong Kong and many other issues in this week's summit. So the person wants to, I suppose, would have you engage with the notion of decoupling. How much is decoupling possible? What does the global economy look like in a world in which this is a policy option at the very least? And what does it mean for the Belt and Road Initiative?
Great, thank you. So for Dr. Mutombo's question, so two-track world, I mean, one sort of way of understanding it is, kind of when you have your computer, your laptop, and you've got a choice between, I don't know, Chrome and an Explorer, kind of, and so you have the same sort of computer and, a lot of the same functions, but some things you can do on one sort of system and you can't do on the other. And, it kind of works. I think we sort of think in these binary ways, maybe more than kind of it's appreciated. And there's been all sorts of examples in the past, of kind of, being able to have a global system where you do have this sort of binary kind of approach. And so, the question is, well, in geopolitics, it's not easy. It usually ends up with competition, as you say, and it means that people like in Europe and Africa and Latin America are stuck with this choice of, do you kind of stick close to the Americans or the Chinese? Now, until now, I think that issue has been, well, for your economic prosperity, more and more you're thinking about China, and for your security, you're thinking about America. I mean, that's been true in Asia. I mean, Australia, where I was based for 3.5 years, very significant, biggest trading partner, China, biggest investor, China, but major security partnership with the United States. And I think we're all in that kind of camp in a way. We need to kind of always try and balance these two. COVID-19 has made that balancing act almost impossible, because on the one hand, if China does get out of this economic crisis more quickly and better than others, it's going to be very natural for people to want to trade and have investment and do more economically with China than they do already. But it also means that the security issues are going to become much sharper, because China will feel more strong, and it's been accused of bullying and being pushy, and kind of recently really with India and others, really kind of using its sort of new powers to kind of push people around. So this is sort of really making what was once even 6 months ago a relatively manageable problem increasingly unmanageable. So Africa is, in a sense, in a little bit of a better place than Europe. I think that under Trump, Europe is in the firing line. for NATO, for all these other issues, because of Trump's mindset about, kind of Europeans not paying for their security, being freeloaders, it is pretty clear that he wants more from Europe. And there is an impatience with Europe, kind of saying, oh, look, for our economic interests, we're going to do more with China, but we'll still carry on being your friend. America wants to hear something different, which is, no, even if we have to take sacrifices, we're going to stick by you, America. And if he doesn't hear that from the Europeans, then, there are consequences. Sometimes just unpleasant language, and sometimes, kind of the threat to impose tariffs and things like this. And under Huawei, kind of really a threat. The telecoms company from China, the UK has tried to maintain some sort of balance about this. But no way will Huawei be able to do very much in the UK, because if it does, America will immediately say this is a security threat, and they will not do a lot of the very high level security stuff they do with the UK. So for Africa, those issues are not so sharp, because it isn't, an actor like NATO. African countries have different sorts of security relations with America. So there's not that kind of issue so sharply. And you could argue that in some ways, kind of Africa still has a strong, and African countries have a strong legitimate argument to say, we have not got the sort of, trading relationships and support that we need from America and others. And China is offering us things that we can legitimately take. And these are not the sort of security issues that we kind of, we see posed in Europe, because our security situation is different. I'm sure America will still be quite unhappy about some of those arrangements, but I think it's a question of degree. I don't think it will be quite as unhappy as it has been, particularly with Europe. Whether China is opportunistic about that or not is another matter. I think, the kind of unpleasant sort of response that some Chinese have to Africans based in China in the last few months over COVID, the complaint made by many African ambassadors based in Beijing, a very, very kind of new sort of, kind of anger at that level of discrimination in China. This is a sort of new aspect. And whether China will feel that it wants to get more deeply involved and expose itself to places it's never really worked in so deeply before, and that's another question. But I'm sure that if African countries want to, they can create more space for Chinese, to invest and do things, and it won't create the sort of security issues it does, particularly in Europe. On the issue of decoupling, the second question, I don't think decoupling is very possible or likely. It's a rhetoric, right? We can talk about not manufacturing in China. And that's been happening for 10 years. Not just recently. Japan was talking about decoupling from China in about 2009. But I talked to a Japanese analyst recently, and they said very, very clearly that, in fact, there are many, many Japanese companies that still do fine in China. And so this decoupling has been extremely partial. There's some areas, yes, they definitely don't do stuff, and others where they do. If you look at Zoom, the company that we're using at the moment, most of their engineers and a lot of their, kind of technology is supplied by Chinese technologists working for Zoom. Other companies have tried to put their technology provision elsewhere. You can have a partial decoupling, but a comprehensive decoupling, I think, is almost impossible. So I don't expect to see that. A two-track world is, to me, a world in which you have some things you can definitely still work deeply with China, or maybe more deeply, but you have a bunch of things that you don't, and you never really did anyway, but you just don't, you have very clear boundaries. Thank you.
The other question, Prof, that is here from Mr. Baleni is that with regard to the strained relationship between China and the US, if Trump loses the elections, are we likely to see the end of the trade war championed by Trump? Is there any other question, Baso, that we can add?
So I've seen two raised hands. Franz Maleni and Wesley Siale. I think Franz Maleni has been attended to. So maybe Wesley can also ask his question.
Thank you very, very much for the presentation by Prof and also for the Centre for organizing this. My question has to do with COVID-19 seems to be one of many challenges at the moment for China. Earlier, a couple of weeks ago, we had Hong Kong, Taiwan, India, Japan in the last couple of days. I was wondering whether Prof could comment maybe on what he thinks is happening within the Communist Party at the moment in China. Of course, with various challenges throughout the years, it's always interesting to note at what are the changes happening internally in the party. And I was thinking maybe if he could just shed a bit of light on what he thinks is happening within the Communist Party at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. On Trump and Biden, so I think the consensus is that the China issue will not dramatically go away, and that if Biden were to become president, a similar approach, but in a more multilateral way, would happen. So, the kind of Trump approach has been fairly sort of haphazard and distinctive, and in a sense, there's these rumors that, well, and they're not rumors. There's been a kind of reports that many analysts in China would look forward to a Trump presidency, a second term, because they feel that almost by the day, America's commitment to multilateralism is weakening, and in itself is therefore weakening, and that Biden, in some ways, might be a harder proposition because there would probably be a bigger commitment to multilateralism. There would probably be more coherence. There would probably be a much more systematic approach to, dealing with China, rather than just, the kind of very transactional approach of Trump going along and, doing his deals and almost being like a one-man band. So, I kind of think the easiest thing you can say is that whatever happens, Trump or Biden, America and China are in a period where they are just not going to be particularly friendly to each other. That's just the way it is, and that's not going to come to an end anytime soon. The question is just how unfriendly they get to each other before we should start to worry. And although things have been said recently which are disturbing, it's still to me unlikely that this will kind of go into an actual physical conflict, largely because the stakes are so high. The only real possibility of that is by misinterpretation and mistake, and that's horribly possible, but I think at the moment improbable, but it is possible. On the Communist Party and its internal issues, that's an excellent question. Of course, there's been rumors that Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang have some contradictions between, accepting the market trading economy and kind of, it's almost as though the issues in our economies of some politicians wanting to just get out of the lockdowns as soon as possible, no matter what the public health kind of risk might be, because of the huge economic challenges building up, that kind of they're opposed by those who really privilege and prioritize dealing with the public health issue and just don't want to make any risks there and think we just have to live with the economic consequences. So it seems that Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang are sort of both kind of occupying this kind of, this part on the spectrum. How serious that is hard to say, because, when you look at the situation of the Communist Party now, at the beginning of the year, Xi Jinping, because of the enormity of what was happening, looked vulnerable and kind of maybe even a bit isolated. But has been saved in a way. If there was a problem then, he has been saved by the terrible response of the outside world to the same problem. And so you can kind of really see him defend himself by saying, well, we had a struggle, but my God, we proved that we can deal with this in ways that governments of the UK and others usually criticizing us didn't. So I think that's given him, kind of more sort of leverage. And the other thing I would pay attention to is the fact that, we are now, in a normal cycle, I mean, and I know a new normal cycle only ever happened really twice, maybe just once, with Hu Jintao succeeding Jiang Zemin, and then, yeah, twice. So Hu Jintao succeeding Jiang Zemin was relatively orderly, and then Xi Jinping succeeding Hu Jintao nearly, 9 years ago. So at this point, kind of 10 years ago, we had some ideas of successors. And we look in China now, and we don't see any sign of successors. It's clear that Xi Jinping is as people thought, when he extended or got rid of the constitutional limits, 5-year limits on the presidency, and made it kind of perpetual. That there's a very big likelihood that he is going to stay in that position, and whether that's under a kind of arrangement where someone else, is the party secretary. I mean, that's possible. That's what Deng Xiaoping did, kind of not as president, but as paramount leader in the 1980s. And so you can, have flexibility, kind of there are things that Xi can do, but it's clear that he is going to be the dominant political force for the foreseeable future. And so I don't see at the moment a kind of serious schism. If the economy proves not to be very fixable, if there is consistent negative growth and unemployment rises, then things change. Because there is no experience in the modern times, I mean, last 40 years at least, of a Chinese leader having that kind of combination. There's always been growth, even in tough times, mostly, kind of bad growth for a quarter, like during SARS, and then things bounce back. But having 2 or 3 quarters of bad growth, that's different. So the next quarter, when the kind of announcement for growth on this, when the announcement for what growth is during this quarter comes out, that's going to be an important moment, because that should, kind of be an indication of just how deep the problems China is in. But if, it's perpetual, then politics will radically change. At the moment, although it's not optimal, I think Xi Jinping is looking relatively secure. And that's not surprising, because he has really effectively, kind of built networks around him that are very supportive and interlinked with him. And there isn't very easy alternatives. I mean, I can't see any very easy networks that could replace the ones that are in power at the moment. Thank you.
Okay, Prof. There is a question from Zenzo Moyo, and she says, a two-track world is polarized and has tendency to hollow the middle. Either way, its natural progression will lead to the rest being forced to choose sides, whether they are African, European, Latin American, or Asian. She then says, Prof, you seem to suggest that we can live almost in harmony with such a phenomenon. But if the middle gets hollowed, are we not returning to Cold War with permanent damage to international relations? There is also a raised hand by Dr. Shilao. Dr. Shilao, your mic is on.
Thank you so much, moderator. Thank you, Prof. Prof, my question is that you said in the event that China becomes the most dominant economy in the world, that would spell problems with values that the US espouses, because China is a self-interested actor. And I would imagine you're talking about values such as democracy, human rights, rule of law, justice, and the like, because these are attributes that China is not often associated with. But as it is currently, America seems to wax lyrical when it comes to these values, but they do not follow through and ensure that they're upheld, even back at home and internationally, that they're also self-interested. They will work with anybody as long as that particular individual, and specifically a leader, is aligned to them. And they wouldn't care whether that leader steals elections or brutalizes people. And their assault against the International Criminal Court, which predates the coming into power of Donald Trump, attests to that. So I would want you to clarify what values would China's rise to the pinnacle of the international power, how would it pose a threat to, what kind of values would China pose a threat to in the event that it rises to the pinnacle of international power? Thank you.
We have one more question or comment from Lichi Huang. Your microphone is on, Huang.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor, for your speech. It's quite frank and also enlightening. I'm Lichi Huang from Wits University. The question I have is about the threat myth. Professor mentioned that everything, in your lecture, everything with China will end in politics. So I'm quite curious because Professor mentioned that the difference in the value system and also the behaviors of China might be the source of this distrust. I'm just trying to imagine, like if I'm an individual growing up in China, if in the process of myself becoming an adult, I have no offense to other countries or other people, but I was asked to follow other people's expectations all the time and will be judged according to other people's principles. And that principles are changing always. So could you tell me how an individual like me will live if now in a constant misery or anxious state? So do you think, like based on the individual example I just narrated, do you think like the world is treating China fairly? Can you explain that, how that threat of politicizing everything coming from? Is it evidence-based? Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. So they're all difficult questions. They're all really difficult questions. So I guess for the first question, polarizing leading to a sort of new Cold War. I mean, I think we have to recognize that we, in a sense, Fukuyama was right. History did end, but not the way that I think he wrote about. I mean, in a sense, globalization is here to stay for many, many things. Pandemics and the way that they're treated prove that. But there are other areas where we're going to, I think, get a retrenchment and more localization. I mean, I think this is the sort of process, very complicated, kind of almost sort of two opposing forces, globalization and localization. And we see that manifested in sort of politics all over the world with the populists arising. And so I think in that context, it's not going to be a Cold War, because a Cold War was kind of neat. It was like the USSR and its world and America and its world. And kind of, they almost sort of sat beside each other. They had limited contact with each other. And there was a fairly big boundary, the Iron Curtain, as Churchill famously called it. And this has got no Iron Curtain at all. This is, sort of very, very, very messy. If you try and find boundaries, they don't really exist in terms of, kind of technology, in terms of sort of communication flows, in terms of these, kind of trade flows. China is the biggest trading partner to, I think, about 125 countries. And China is, in some ways, a capitalist country, more successfully capitalist than many other sort of capitalist countries. So this is, not going to be a very sort of easy world to find neat boundaries. And so I don't think there'll be polarization, because we will have to choose case by case where we work with each other and where we don't. So, so there'll be polarization probably on some things. In telecoms with Huawei, there is now polarization. Huawei can't work in Australia, it can't really work in America or Canada, and it's not likely to do a lot of work in Europe. And yet it does a lot of work in Africa and Latin America, and in Asia, of course, and is very successful there. So there's a sort of polarization there. So I think a kind of partial polarization in some areas, but also a deeper collaboration in others is the situation we're working towards. And that's a sort of very unusual situation. It's a very, very unusual situation, because I think we're living in a very a very, the history now is not as it ever was before because of this complexity, and because of how much is shared and how much is, common between all powers. You just can't divide. I mean, the issue of the United States and its values and China and its values, I mean, so broadly, I think that China's value system is a hybrid one. That's why it's different. I mean, it's able to embrace Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, Marxist Leninism, Xi Jinping thought, capitalism. I mean, it's uniquely hybrid. There's no sort of dominant kind of mindset, I guess. And the United States, of course, is sort of quite systematic, and its values are Judeo-Christian and sort of broadly that basis. It's sort of a kind of commitment to a sort of single view of what the world is. And so I think the United States, with its values, it sort of thinks that these are good for everyone, and it's been very proselytizing in the past. The house upon the hill, the fact that America is regarded really as a model that others should follow. And I suppose we have two things now. One is that I mean China now does not remotely want, I think, to promote its values, its Chinese values, to the world around it. I think it thinks that they're Chinese values that are only applying to it. So I don't think it's a proselytizer. And I suppose, as the person who asked the question rightly said, under Trump, we have seen, well, in fact, before that, maybe, during the Iraq wars in the early 2000s, we've seen a sort of loss of moral authority increasingly. And I mean, maybe in the 1980s, very early on, there were many in China who were attracted by the values and the sort of things that were espoused by America and others. And in Tiananmen Square, 1989, there was a sort of moment, I suppose, when there was a little bit of a possibility that China would kind of go along the path that the USSR went eventually, but that didn't happen. Okay, so I think now we've got this kind of clash between the Americans, who are universalists and proselytizers, and the Europeans too, the Enlightenment powers, if you want to call them that, and a China which is anti-universalist, is not a proselytizer, but is a self-interested actor. And so, this kind of is immediately the reason why I say that we need to think of a two-track world, because I can't see an easy way of accommodating these very different views of how fundamentally you see the world. And that really sort of a kind of to the final question, China's responsibilities and, is China being treated fairly? I mean, I suppose it's now such a significant power that it's not a question of it being treated fairly or not. It is now going to be increasingly scrutinized. And, that's why under Xi Jinping, I think you've seen a lot of effort made into sort of telling the China story. But I guess one thing that's been noticeable during COVID-19 is that, China is often wanting to get validated by the outside world, kind of the face mask diplomacy in Italy and things like this. And I'm sure that it's doing that, with good intentions, but it's interpreted often very negatively. And I think there's two things to think about here. One is that, to be honest, many in the outside world are, not familiar with China and its culture, its history, its politics, and so it's all very new to them. They haven't the knowledge base, I think, to make a great deal of sense of this new power that's coming along. And I think, secondly, although China has put effort into this, its way of speaking to the world is often, kind of really as though it was speaking to a domestic audience. And obviously, it's talking to a very different kind of audience the moment you leave the borders of China. And, kind of there's suddenly this sort of massive mismatch when China talks about, kind of face mask diplomacy and these kind of things. These sound fine in China. I mean, they absolutely sound fine. But outside of China, of course, they sound very, very different. I do think, for young Chinese, like my students, like probably students you've got in South Africa and elsewhere, it is confusing really, because, in some senses, why is it that China's prominence in the world is such a problem. Kind of it's contributing economically and in all sorts of other areas. It's involved in peacekeeping missions, and kind of it's involved in kind of lots of different areas. It hasn't had really a big conflict in modern times. The skirmish with India the other day was really unusual, and also it wasn't huge numbers. And so it is puzzling, I think, for young Chinese, why is China's image such a problem? And that's why I say the political issues always take control, because China is one thing. China as a communist country is the thing that seems to really antagonize many political and other figures, particularly in Europe and America. And I often think, if China were not a communist country, or if it were a different political model, what issues would we have with China? And I think we'd still have issues. The outside world would still have issues. But this particular thing, the kind of political nature, the political nature of the political identity of China, is the thing that everyone seems to know. And it's sort of almost like a brand problem. If China were to call itself social democrat tomorrow, but sort of maintain the same system, I wonder whether a lot of these problems wouldn't go away. So I think that's not going to, it doesn't seem to me that, this issue of China's political model is going to stop being a problem for outsiders. And that's not to say that China shouldn't have the model that it's got. I'm making no judgment on that. But it's certainly true that political model, for many observing China, is the thing that they really focus on. And it's hard to explain to them why they should think about other things.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the end of our hour with Professor Kerry Brown. I believe we've had a very enlightening and insightful and very thoughtful 62 minutes. And we'd like to express our deepest gratitude to Professor Brown for taking the time to speak with us today. And we hope that soon he can be here physically to take the show on the road, so to speak, and come to Johannesburg. We've also been wonderfully chaired by Dr. David Meyer, and we'd very much like to thank him for guiding this session. We'd also like to thank the people behind the scenes, of course, who put all of this together, our wonderful staff at the library, our strategic partner, and of course, our Center for Africa-China Studies. And of course, these proceedings are enlivened and vivified by the audience participation. And we've had several very excellent questions that spoke to the heart of the issues and highlighted, I believe, that these issues are on people's mind. And as Professor Kerry Brown said at the beginning of his session, China has come to the fore of people's attentions in these times. So we hope that you will join us again on our next webinar, same place, same time, as they say, on the 21st of July, where we'll be looking at Fourth Industrial Revolution technologies and partnerships, international partnerships for technological innovation, where some of the things that were touched on tonight, including the pointed issue of the digital iron curtain, will be delved into in that session. So with that said, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you soon. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Prof, and everyone for joining us. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Doctor.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.